Welcome, everyone, to another rendition of God's Provisions Live. This is your hostess, Marsha Ogletree, and we thank you for joining us. And we're going to have a very special time tonight with a very special guest. And we are happy that you would join us for this occasion. We thank you for an opportunity that as we just present my sister here, that you would just listen with open ears and open heart and hear everything that she has that would bless you, and hopefully that you can be a blessing to her as well. So I'm introducing tonight Dr. Vanessa Enoch, and who I've known for a number of years, and who is I believe, an absolutely wonderful person with great integrity, with brilliance, with equity and fairness, as being just some of the stamps of who she is and all that she's done. I've never known her to lie, cheat, or steal, and those are very high qualities in this day and this age. And so I said, she is my sister in the Lord. Welcome, Dr. Enoch.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me.
Well, we are so glad that you're here, and I can't wait to dig in. We don't have a lot of time, so I want to just kind of jump right in, if that's okay with you.
That's perfectly fine with me.
Okay. And since I've known you for such a long time, so if I just kind of dig too fast, you let me
Get
know.
to digging.
Get to digging. Well, let's start out, first of all, just a little bit of your background, Dr. Enoch. I know that you're not originally a Cincinnati native. Can you kind of tell us about your time growing up?
So I'm kind of from the country. My family is from Portsmouth, Ohio, so I spent my early years in Portsmouth. And I was actually about 10 or 11 when I came to Cincinnati. And we lived out in Colerain Township on the suburbs of Cincinnati, actually, when I came to live in Cincinnati. So that's
so country girl, the city girl.
Yeah, for sure. I'm definitely a country girl. In fact, some of those suburban country girls taught me how to dance and how to listen to secular music, because anything except for country music, because when I came to Cincinnati, I was listening to what my grandma was listening to, and that was Charlie Pride and Waylon Jennings and Dolly Parton. So when I say I'm a country girl, I literally mean I'm a country girl.
Mm-hmm. You probably still remember some of those songs, I would imagine.
I do.
So when you get it around that group, you have something to relate to.
Yes.
Well, there are so many things that have happened to you along the way, but one of my favorite things is, of course, that you went to The Ohio State University.
Woohoo, go Bucks. Absolutely. Which, of course, is also important in, forming some of my thoughts and my understanding of how the world works, but definitely, yes.
Absolutely. So tell us your journey since then in terms of education.
So I received a bachelor's degree at The Ohio State University, and then I went to school to get a criminal justice degree because I saw the unfairness in the court system and wanted to help people who were treated unfairly. And I discovered the unfairness at an early age when a couple of my cousins ended up going to jail for stuff that, I didn't think that they should have to go to jail for. Some illness and drug abuse and that sort of thing. And I wanted to understand more about how the court worked. Mm-hmm. Later on, I did a master's degree in business administration. I had spent some time being a drug and alcohol counselor. And what I understood about that experience is that oftentimes people fall into drug abuse when they've fallen on hard times. They have financial problems and different stressors. So I wanted to actually impact the stressor, and that was the inability to work or not being able to find a good paying job. So I wanted to create jobs. So I went back to school and got a business degree so I could understand how business works, so I could create jobs. After that, a number of years later, I went back to school to get a terminal degree. So I did a PhD in public policy, which is interesting because my the initial reason why I ended up doing criminal justice is I wanted to become a lawyer because I wanted to write policy. And later on discovered that it isn't criminal justice people or lawyers who write policy, it is policymakers, which led me to where I am today with a PhD in public policy and with a desire to go to Congress. So that's how I ended up on that journey, just really wanting to impact policy and make sure that policy was fair to all, especially people who look like me, brown people. So I decided to pursue a career as a public official.
Okay, so I'm going to delve more into that because along the way we have marriage and we have children. So
I forgot all about that part of my life. I thought you wanted to get to the good parts. You want to go and talk about the hard parts of life.
All of those
and that's
are
being a wife and raising children. Absolutely,
you
those do definitely make up who I am.
Absolutely,
and really separate and apart from the career that I've made for myself, but definitely made that career journey a little more challenging as a mom and as a wife and as a business owner.
Well, first tell me about your marriage to your first husband and that venture to South Africa, excuse me.
So he is from Swaziland, Southeast Africa, and so I lived in South Africa for a couple of years, and out of that relationship came my first child, and she is 28 years old, so if you can imagine, that's how long ago that was, and that was quite an experience. I definitely would do all over again. I enjoyed living in South Africa, of course, being young and, there's some challenges in relationships
Absolutely.
at any age.
Absolutely.
But when you're young, and I was in my early 20s, and so, just met with some difficulties along the way, and I ended up coming back home and bringing my daughter with me back to the States, and initially raising her as a single mom for a few years. And then several years later, I met my second husband and married and had my youngest daughter. And so, interesting journey. And just like with anybody else, again, challenges along the way, but that's life, that's marriage, that's family. Yep.
And very beautiful and accomplished young ladies also. And you did a phenomenal job, but sometimes it's not always the easiest to be in those kind of positions and having to walk your way through that. Right. And like you say, you talk about the struggle making you who you are also. And I've experienced that firsthand as I've seen some of the things that have happened in your life. And I love to say the fact that your husband was to be or is the king of Swazi? Or
he is a chief, and he is from a very prominent family. In fact, he is in the lineage of Shaka Zulu.
Oh, how exciting!
My daughter and Shaka Zulu's mother, Nandi, came from the same family, and that is the Mtetwa paramountcy. So the Mtetwas were the chieftainship in Swaziland, and so they are of royal lineage.
Absolutely. So we can still call you Queen Vanessa.
You can call me that. Whether I answer to Queen Vanessa is something different, but you can definitely call me that.
Well, and I think this only begins to give our listeners just a view and an understanding of the depths of what you bring when we look at the office that you're going for, trying to acquire. So let's talk about some of the things that have happened in this journey, because it's been a very venturous journey, to say the least.
To say the least. I would use probably the term tumultuous. It's been difficult. because on the journey to becoming, as Michelle Obama might say, there are rocks and mountains and oceans that you got to cross along the way.
Absolutely.
And so, of course, I've had those. I've met with some of those challenges. And, in particular, I think about when I was working on my dissertation, I initially started out working on my dissertation looking at funding for kids who, just looking at the fairness of funding policy for children who desire to go to college. And one of the things that I found is that many African American children from low-income families, especially single-parent-headed households, are not as inclined to go to college. And I wanted to learn more about why. And what I discovered along the way is many of those kids end up in the school-to-prison pipeline.
Okay.
As I was discovering that, I did a case study on Judge Tracy Hunter here in Cincinnati to understand a little more about the courts and leadership in the courts and her as a woman leader. And what I discovered, first and foremost, is she was dealing with a system that did not want to change. And as a result of being the first coming into that system, she was the first Democrat and the first African American to ever hold a seat in the juvenile court here in Hamilton County. And again, because of being the first, she experienced a number of challenges as the first. And I, coming into that circumstance, just really wanting to learn more, I was in my PhD program and required to do a case study. And part of that case study, I had to write articles for local papers and to also report to local news media, or national news media. And so I chose to do my case study on Judge Hunter. And on the very first day of court, I ended up getting arrested for...
Stop. Freeze.
Absolutely.
How does that happen?
Well, that was my first introduction in understanding that you don't have to be a criminal to end up in a criminal justice system.
Okay, you want to repeat that, please?
Yeah, you don't have to be a criminal to end up in the criminal justice system.
Having inserted yourself into the midst of this to begin to get the information that you needed for your dissertation, that particular day, what happened on the outsides of that courtroom so that you can kind of bring us up to speed on how you got inserted into the whole political agenda and arena of what was going on?
Right. So I had not yet started my dissertation. That was a case study for a class that I was in. And so when I came outside that courtroom, there was a very loud commotion, and I ended up witnessing them harassing her former court bailiff. And in the midst of that, I ended up being arrested along with him simply because I was observing.
Yes.
And the deputies felt threatened by the fact that I was observing and looking at names and that sort of thing. And so they decided that they would arrest me too.
Well, Dr. Enoch, I think we just stop right there, catch a breath, and let's take a break right in the midst of this. Thank you. We'll be back with more.
I'm Vanessa Enoch, and I love my country, but my opponent is unpatriotic. In 2016, he called U.S. veterans moochers and pretenders. In 2021, he voted to overturn the presidential election. In 2022, he voted against supplying aid to Ukraine and against investigating Russia for war crimes. He even voted against Finland and Sweden joining NATO. Is Davidson working for Putin? Vote for me and I will support our veterans and the fight for freedom with our European allies. I'm Vanessa Enoch, and I approve this message.
And we're back with God's Provisions Live. And we have in our studio Dr. Vanessa Enoch, who is running for Congress. And we have we have had just an awesome discussion with her, and we are at a place where we need to get back to where we left off, because boy, oh boy, we are in the midst of something that is absolutely changed her life and will change yours when you hear it. So, Dr. Enoch, we left you outside the courtroom, involved heavily with Judge Tracy Hunter's case, where you were standing in opposition to what had happened and what was transpiring in the hallway. Can you kind of pick it up from there, please?
So as a result of, witnessing what was happening there in that hallway, when I got ready to leave, the deputies actually commanded me to come back and proceeded to search my iPad. Well, they asked to search the iPad, and because I had confidential information from having interviewed folks and that sort of thing for my research, I refused to hand over that iPad. And then they told me that if I didn't hand it over, I would be arrested for not handing it over. So at that point, I did allow them to search the iPad, and they still arrested me. And they charged me with disorderly conduct and failure to ID myself. And I should note that they asked for an ID after my hands were already handcuffed behind my back, as though I could produce
Wow.
an ID at that point. And I never raised my voice. I never, did anything disorderly. And yet they put out a press release that said I was disorderly. They trumped up an entire story and said I yelled at sheriff's deputies in the courtroom.
Wow.
And that's why I was arrested in the hallway, and all sorts of interesting things. And of course, there was no camera footage or anything of that nature, yet there were cameras all over the courtroom, inside the courtroom that day. So essentially, they created that story, made that story up.
Well, so you got arrested and your iPad confiscated. And so just like Watergate, we're going to call this iPadding while black.
Exactly. That's what I'm
And
calling
she was
my book.
arrested for
Yes.
iPadding while black.
Yes.
And so this led you into the court system, literally and figuratively, to deaths you probably had never anticipated or ever thought of. And recently you had verdicts. They took you to court.
No. Well, they ended up dropping the charges.
Okay.
They did charge me, but they dropped those charges almost immediately. In fact, they arrested the bailiff, and he didn't even have to go to court, because when I showed up in court, they let me know that they had dropped the charges. So they didn't pursue those charges, and inevitably ended up dropping the charges. However, I sued them for
that's how-
having arrested me.
Gotcha.
And it took 8 years for that case to make it to
8
court.
years.
Yep, 8 years. And I ended up in just this March winning that case against them. But believe it or not, it's not over.
Oh,
So
my.
I was awarded a $30,000 verdict, and the prosecutor's office continues to appeal.
Wow,
which,
with our taxpayer money, right?
Right, exactly. So they're fighting, paying me $30,000,
Wow.
and they now owe my attorneys probably over $2 million for the fight, just continuing the fight. They don't want to pay me $30,000, so in order to avoid paying me $30,000, they're racking up attorneys' bills in the millions.
Wow. And we as taxpayers sit by, and this continues to be the way they abuse our system.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and
and
so-
they get to line their pockets with taxpayer dollars, and paying off all the attorneys along the way, while the citizen that they actually harassed and arrested unjustly awaits this entire process. And so now it's been over 8 years.
8 years in prosecuting.
Eight and
One
a-
person who
it's been
was,
more 8.5 years now.
was awarded $30,000.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me, and this is something that always struck me and continues to haunt me, that you discovered as you did your research into the juvenile justice systems. How much is that system paid each day for one child that is brought into that system?
For each child, they get about $200,000 a year per child. And if you can imagine, they only get about $9,000 in Cincinnati public schools is what it costs to educate a child. So imagine if they diverted those funds towards educating our children as opposed to incarcerating them, and what that would save in tax dollars for taxpayers.
So basically, we have a whole counter system that's counter our children, and wants to actually put us away when we disrupt that system, which you and Judge Hunter apparently were doing.
Well, yeah, when you start uncovering the truth of what was going on in the system in terms of, how they're making money on the backs of our children.
Right.
And how they are sending our children through that system, oftentimes without proper legal representation. They're ruining parents' careers and jobs by making them sit downtown all day in a court situation, waiting on their cases to be heard. So there are a number of things. The kids are sharing underwear, and they are coming into court looking like they stepped out of an episode of Roots and
or in
various
chains,
kinds of
if I
things.
understand correctly. Initially,
they were initially chained, and
not just feet, but hands and
feet. Just
so
like
we're putting shackles on children that are less than 18 years old.
Exactly. Shackled. And sometimes kids as young as 5 years old came into the courtroom shackled. Absolutely.
So mothers and dads, you want to take note of this and begin to get more understanding you get to be able to see what you need to do to impact that and make a difference. I didn't ask you this because this is so important for me, and then I'm preparing for my audience. How did you find the Lord? Because you are a deacon in your church.
Yes.
What was all of that about for you?
So I actually got saved in 1989, and saved with evidence of speaking in tongues, and did not understand at that time what that all meant. I had no earthly idea of who the Holy Ghost was.
So how did that happen to you, all that particular event?
So, I had experienced, I'd broken up with my boyfriend. I was a college student, and I went to church and with my mentor at that time, and I was reading the Word and sitting in church on that day, and I was reading 2 Timothy 3rd chapter. And as I was reading that chapter, and it talks about how men would be boastful and proud, lovers of themselves, and I'm reading all of the words, and it talked about silly women laden with sins, ever learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. And I'm reading these words that leaped off of the page to me because I understood what the word was saying on a very spiritual level. And that day is when I found myself, I lifted up out of the pews on the church pew, and heading to the front of the church. I don't remember walking. I felt like I was floating to the front of that church. And I joined the church that day, and that evening I got baptized. But my mentor brought it to my attention. She said, "What were you saying when you were going up to the front of the church?" And I was able to tell her what I was saying in English. And she said, "No, you were speaking in tongues." And I'm like, "What is speaking in tongues?" And she said, "You were not speaking English," wow. Which was the weirdest thing to me because I heard myself speaking in English. And she said, "No, you were not speaking in English," which intrigued me that,
right.
I was being told I wasn't speaking in English. That started my journey with the Lord. And even though that started my journey with the Lord, I was straddling the fence for many years, even after coming to the Lord and having received the Holy Ghost. But what that did for me in attaining my salvation on that day is it inclined my ears, attuned my ears to hearing the Lord speak. And so I began to be convicted surrounding the various things, the way I was living and that sort of thing. And that conviction continued to draw me closer. So I did learn that, salvation is a process. You don't just get saved one day and you stop, or at least most of us don't, just stop everything. And, but it is a process of listening to the Lord and walking with them and learning
Absolutely.
the heart of God and really understanding the mind of God.
Right.
And that's what took several years.
In the midst of all you've gone through, I want you to share, because I think this is a testimony of your relationship with the Lord, what happened with your house.
Definitely a testimony of my relationship with the Lord. So in that process of being arrested, about a month, 3 weeks later after the arrest, I was on a television show, on the Lincoln Ware Issues show, which is a morning show, early morning show, talking about the arrest. It wasn't until that early morning show that my employer, which was a contractor, I have my own business, so I was an independent contractor, and the company that I worked for at the time as a contractor decided to end my contract as a result of that arrest.
Wow.
And so I ended up losing my job and having to really start back at the drawing board, rebuilding my business, etc. So in the course of that, I ended up trying to modify my mortgage, and banks had rejected Barack Obama's modification plan. They decided they weren't going to follow it. The bank that I was with at that time, the consumer, I can't remember what the name of it was a government organization headed up by Rich Cordray, who ended up being a candidate for governor here in Ohio. But that organization, I think was it Rich who headed that up?
Yeah,
consumer.
It was consumer something or other.
Yeah, I can't remember but he was appointed by Barack Obama.
Yeah.
So after the bank refused to honor those modifications, so my paperwork, amongst other people's paperwork, sat there, and they continued to say, you need to send us more, you need to send this and send that, and I was consistently sending the same paperwork over and over again, trying to get my mortgage modified so that I could, stay current with my mortgage and get the payments adjusted for a while or whatever. They ignored all of that. Ultimately, there was a consent decree that was a consent order against them that said you have to modify these mortgages and you have to compensate the people who you harmed in the course of this. Well, they never did do that. What they did is sold off all of the mortgages to a foreclosure mill.
Wow.
So they ended up foreclosing on my house and selling my house at a foreclosure sale.
Wow.
So a few months later, well, actually on the day my house was sold at a foreclosure sale, the Lord told me, you will redeem it. And I'm waiting for a couple of months, and I'm like, okay. So the redemption period, I looked up the redemption period on the day the Lord spoke. The redemption period was 60 days. So I said, okay, Lord, you have 60 days.
So you had 60 days to get your house out of foreclosure.
To get it out of foreclosure before they actually sold it.
Okay.
And so on the 59th day, I made a decision because I was running for office at the time. I decided on the 59th day, I'm moving because I don't want cameras and the sheriff's office to show up and remove me and my child from my house on television while I'm running for office. And, that just would have been the most humiliating thing ever in life. And so I moved to a gated community where I would be away from the media, etc. And the Lord told me, you still own the house. You will cut the grass and take care of the house. I had to continue paying the gas and electric bill, even though my house had been sold at foreclosure. And I still continued to do what the Lord said do. And a few months later, in October of that year, I received a bill for, this is a couple of months after my house was sold at foreclosure sale. I received a bill for my taxes, and I was angry. Why am I receiving a bill for taxes when I don't even own my house anymore? It's been sold at foreclosure sale. Well, I called to find out. I called the court first, and they said, no, the house is still in your name. And I said, well, what am I supposed to do? She said, sell it. I'm like, the house got sold at foreclosure. How do I sell it? I called the sheriff's office. My house was sold at foreclosure sale. He said, oh, no, ma'am, the sale did not go through. And I'm like, wait, what? Wow. So at that time, the Lord said, get insurance on the house.
Okay.
So I had to pay for insurance. First of all, I'm out of my house.
You're living in a gated community.
Living in a gated community temporarily, paying all of the bills at the house and paying all of the, and now I had to pay insurance on a house that I'm not in. I said, Lord, this has got to be the craziest thing ever. But I'm obedient, so I listened. Flash forward to February. I'm still paying the insurance, and the Lord said, discovered in February, it was the coldest day of the year. I had gone out of town, and now I went to my house every day and continued caring for my house. I was out of town for a few days, returned back from out of town, and apparently the power got knocked out by an ice storm.
Wow.
And just the time that house, it was the coldest weekend of the year. In the time that the heat was out in my house, the roof ended up leaking in 5 rooms in my house. Wow. And so I did call the insurance company and said, okay, my roof is leaking in, 5 rooms. They show up, they look at the roof and said, actually, no, we can't repair your roof because your policy is new. So I said, Lord, you told me to get insurance on this house. And they told me they couldn't fix it. So after I railed against the Lord said, go back to them and tell them that you had insurance. You had insurance previously on that house, because they said that the damage would have had to have happened about 18 months before that incident. The Lord said, well, call them and tell them you had their insurance 18 months ago. And if you had known that roof was leaking at that time, that you could have gotten it repaired, and you would have because you had insurance. A friend of mine said, no, they can't do that if the policy is expired. So I looked up the law to see, if they were still obligated to pay. And it turns out the Ohio Revised Code obligates them to pay. So I picked up the phone and called back and said, hey, I had insurance 18 months ago. They said, well, we can't pay on that. I said, well, the Ohio Revised Code says, and I ended up giving them the code. They came back out, looked at my roof, and ended up putting a new, I believe it was $45,000 roof on that house.
Wow, beautiful.
And everything in that house that had gotten damaged, my pipes busted and all kinds of other things in that house. But at that time, so I had to go ahead and put a roof on the house. Now, keep in mind, I'm still not living in the house. The house had still been in foreclosure. And in fact, they put it back up in foreclosure sale again. The Lord said, you're moving back into the house. So I proceeded to get everything. He says, get everything in the house fixed. So my HVAC went out that week that the storm happened. The pipes bursted. The roof was leaking in 5 rooms. The locks on my door were broken because somebody tried to get into my house.
Oh, wow.
And the thermostat broke in my house as a result of all this stuff. It was thousands upon thousands of dollars of damage that I did not have the resources to pay for.
Sure, absolutely.
The Lord said, get it, every single thing fixed. You're moving back in the house. Now, I had this foreclosure hanging over my head, And there was no possible way that I could assume that I'd be moving back in that house aside from hearing the voice of the Lord saying, you're moving back in. Several people offered to buy my house. They kept coming. The roofer even came and made an offer. And he was willing to split the proceeds with me. And I said, absolutely not. The Lord said, I'm moving back in my house. And I continued moving forward as though I was moving back in. We got down to the wire. The day before the court date, there was still somebody patching the ceiling in my house. And I'm sitting there and the phone rings. This is the day before it goes back up to foreclosure sale. And it's the mortgage company. We're going to be sending you a packet out in the mail. I said, wait a minute. The house goes up for a foreclosure sale a second time tomorrow. Does that mean you're not going to modify the mortgage? Nothing changed from the initial application that I'd been giving them when they denied this modification. I said, does it mean you're not going to modify the mortgage? She says, we're going to call you back on a recorded line, on a different line. No, she had me call her back. So I had to call her back. I hung up the phone, dialed her right back, and she says, ma'am, we're going to modify your mortgage. We're going to send you out a packet that has the terms of the modification. And, you know, you talking about a miracle. I mean, the day before the house was to go up for sale. And in fact, that same roofer who had continued to make offers called me on maybe about a half hour afterward. And I said, I told you, the Lord said I was moving back in my house. I said, in fact, the bank just called and they're sending out a modification packet. About 3 weeks later, I had moved back into my house. Everything was repaired. And I ended up, the Lord even told me, you're going to have your daughter's graduation party in your house. This was 3 weeks before. In 3 weeks' time, we had moved back into that house. I had gotten everything back in the exact same place it was before I left. And we had a huge graduation party for my daughter in that house.
And I can attest to that. And we're going to put a mark right there because it is awesome to walk with the Lord.
Yes, it is. It absolutely is.
We're going to put a pin in it for a moment.
Absolutely.
As we delve into this next phase.
Amen.
And let's see what running for office looks like.
I'm Vanessa Enoch, and I love my country, but my opponent is unpatriotic. In 2016, he called U.S. veterans moochers and pretenders. In 2021, he voted to overturn the presidential election. In 2022, he voted against supplying aid to Ukraine and against investigating Russia for war crimes. He even voted against Finland and Sweden joining NATO. Is Davidson working for Putin? Vote for me and I will support our veterans and the fight for freedom with our European allies. I'm Vanessa Enoch, and I approve this message.
And we're back. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And for these past several weeks, we have just been enjoying our guest, Dr. Vanessa Enoch, and the things that God has taken her through over these years has just been absolutely phenomenal. And so not to redo those past several weeks, but to just give you an idea of what God has done in her life. She has been through so much. She has an earned doctorate degree. And she has 2 beautiful children. She has traveled internationally. And now she is once again running for Congress. And so as we just kind of begin to take a look at all that entails, if you don't mind, Dr. Enoch, sharing us your thoughts and that process that you went to in order to be able to dive into that arena of politics even deeper.
So, you know, I had always wanted to be involved in writing policy and something surrounding public policy and maybe even running for office one day. After that arrest, I actually decided I didn't want to have anything to do with politics ever again. I never wanted to go anywhere near politics after watching what happened with Judge Hunter. And actually, the Lord spoke to me and said, "You are exactly who I want in politics. You are who I want in office. You know, someone who has integrity, someone who will actually, do what I send you to do." And, God knows that I am going to be obedient. I'm going to listen to him. I'm going to be guided and directed in a manner of integrity in, making that decision to run. It wasn't my own decision to run. I decided to run as a result of God sending me there.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess your first initial venture into this was running for Congresswoman in District 8, I want to say. Is that correct?
Yes. That was when I first ran for Congress in 2018 in District 8. It was John Boehner's old district. But prior to that, I have worked on many, many campaigns. That was my 27th campaign that I'd been involved with, my own campaign.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. So I'd long been involved in helping other people run for office.
What were your learnings those first couple of years during that initial venture?
I think what I learned is that the way that people campaign for public office is, well, first of all, you have a different perspective as a candidate than you do as someone working for a campaign.
Mm-hmm.
That was first and foremost. So I learned a lot more, and I saw things from a completely different perspective than I would have working a campaign. I think some of the things that I learned is that people often will just not be involved in politics.
Sure.
And they actually, often people will take pride in not being involved in politics. I'm not involved politically, and they wear that as a beacon of pride. And in talking to people and helping people understand the importance of voting and what happens when they don't vote, whether you actually register a vote or not, you're voting. You're giving someone else the opportunity to determine your fate.
Absolutely.
And how you'll live when you don't vote. So that perspective and an understanding of just how little people knew about the civic process, I learned when I ran for office. I also learned that public policy isn't just for people who are like me. Public policy has to govern all people,
right?
Everybody, whether they believe like me or not. And so I came to understand and to learn that fairness in public policy looks a lot different than my own personal set of values or an understanding of how that would look and how that should look.
In District 8, that was a challenge for you. I understand it was Boehner's old district, but for you, it was a challenge as a black female.
To an extent. Well, I mean, people would believe that it's a challenge because I'm a black female, and the district is almost 93% white and 6% black, 1% other, right?
Right.
So you would think that would be a challenge. Not necessarily for me. It might have been a challenge for other people. The fact that I do not look like them necessarily, but not for me. I grew up in a family that is, racially diverse and just a very diverse family. So I'm not a stranger to diversity, to people who are different. And so I don't see that as a barrier or an issue. If I saw it as a barrier or an issue, I would not have run for Congress. I think that there are other things aside from my race that dictate my understanding of the challenges that people face. And I'm running for office to represent people.
Well,
right?
Being from Portsmouth,
yeah, I could relate. Being from a rural town,
community, exactly.
rural community, I could relate to those farmers and to the people in the rural communities. You know, things like gun control, where a lot of people just think we should just do away with all guns. And, you know, I'm like, well, wait a minute. You know, when you're in the country, the police don't show up like they do in the city. You know, it might take an hour for a police officer to get there, depending on where you live in the country. And so my grandma was a gun-toting grandma, you know, and so I do have a different mindset and a different way of thinking about, you know, guns. I do believe we need sensible gun legislation, but I am a CCW carrier, and I definitely don't want to do away with everyone's guns. But I do believe that we should be able to be safe going to a movie theater or to a school or what have you.
Well, I can remember so clearly when part of your campaigning led us to a very small town in Ohio where there was I believe it was a pig farm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And there were quite a few pigs on this particular property. Mm-hmm. And I remember you just standing up there campaigning and telling them your platform and what you stood for. And I'm like, well, she's got a lot of nerves.
Well, I don't fear pig farms, and there were some cows there too.
Loved you. They loved
yeah, you. I one of the things I do believe is a gift from God, and that is the ability to relate to people no matter who they are. And to care about people no matter who they are. And I think that is part of the heart that God has given me to be able to go into these spaces and to relate to people and understand their needs and to listen enough to understand and then to be able to even fight for their causes.
What are some of the crucial issues that you learned being out in District 8, which was predominantly Caucasian, predominantly rural, I'd say? Mm-hmm. What were some of those issues? Because I remember talking with you about some of the environmental issues that were really a deep concern.
I mean, there are a number of issues. First and foremost, I think people traditionally have voted against their own interest. People are struggling check to check, trying to make ends meet. And, you know, the cost of living continues to rise while paychecks don't rise with the cost of living, and that is an issue for people no matter where they are, no matter who they are. You know, the environment is definitely an issue, and when you're in the rural areas, you're weighing your need to curb cost and cut cost against how do you deal with the waste on farms. And you know, then there is the protection of the environment, protection of our air and our water. And in particular, in many of those rural areas, a lot of folks in those areas have cancer. And that was hard for me to go, you know, and to have conversations with people and to discover so many people were battling cancer. And I know that cancer is not something that when I was a child, that I remember hearing about people dying of. But now people are sick and dying of cancer on a regular basis. It's so much a part of life. And I'm like, what changed? And, you know, many of the people who are dealing with cancer in the farm community are attributing that to Roundup, the use of Roundup. And you know, I've seen a lot of suffering throughout the district. I've seen people who are struggling with various kinds of issues, and so those are the things that are the reason I ran. I see dilapidated farm communities where the cities have been ignored and legislators don't care about those communities like they do the communities where the big businesses are and the big corporations are. And so part of me wanting to represent the district is to make sure that resources are flowing back to the people.
And so, what would their take as far as Obamacare? Because that's been a large issue where, it's not called Obamacare, but I can't even think of the other term for it right now. But if you're seeing a high rate of cancer and you know that might be a vehicle to bring health care into the communities, what was their take for that in District 8 for the most part, would you say?
I would say when I had one-on-one conversations with the people across District 8, they all were in favor of the Affordable Care Act. Many of those people don't have insurance and didn't have insurance aside from the Affordable Care Act, which is what Obamacare is called.
Sure.
And so for the most part, people were in support of health care and expanding health care. Now, there's a faction of the community, and very few of them that I came in contact with that were the far right folks who were willing to fight against health care and covering pre-existing conditions. And the thing that really bothers me about that is that people believe that they're going to be they'd rather go without insurance than to make sure that other people in need have insurance. Even
so this is like when you mentioned the fact that they're voting against their own self-interest.
Right, exactly. They'd rather see everybody go without insurance than see their tax dollars cover somebody in need, right? Which is very troubling. But there is a minority of folks who are doing everything they can to make sure that everybody suffers.
Yeah,
because
suffers.
Right, it's crazy. It's crazy, but ultimately, from what I understand about this system is that it works for some folks. It works for rich people who get big contracts from the government, and but the little guy doesn't see that because that's not the narrative that is shared with them. What they see is this other group that's suffering is getting more than they're getting, not really seeing where the lion's share of the resources are going, and that's to pad the pockets of the big corporations and big pharma and all these special interest groups.
So let's march you into Hamilton County. So all of a sudden now we have a shift where it's no longer just the predominant figure being the rural farmer and people in the smaller towns. And now we're in Hamilton County. How's that shifted what you're campaigning for, or has it?
So my platform hasn't changed, and for good reason. The same things that we needed in some of those rural communities are the things that are needed even now. So you'll find on my platform things like advancing technology, affordable health care. You'll see things like economic development, job creation, and protecting seniors and veterans, and making sure that women and children are protected. And those are the kinds of things that are the reason I ran. They're also things that impact people no matter where they are and no matter who they are. Those are the people who struggle. Those are the things that we struggle with. And so those are the groups of folks who need a voice in Washington, D.C. And so that is the thing that I'm running on. And the people who I seek to ensure that they have a voice.
Well, I'm just really curious because politics kind of has been part of what you've done for such a long time. Mm-hmm. And as I look at what I see as your platform here, it's very broad, mm-hmm. but yet at the same time, there's some things on here that I don't know how germane they are to our Hamilton County community. You've got human trafficking. Is that a large issue here in Hamilton County?
Absolutely.
Or in
Absolutely.
our region? Tell us about that.
Ohio is, at the time that I developed my platform, Ohio was fourth in the nation for human trafficking. And there are whole websites that people are operating on the internet about young girls who have been trafficked. And believe it or not, the majority of them are African American girls.
Well, we don't hear about that.
You don't hear about that, and it's very troubling. And even more troubling are the disinformation campaigns, because the different disinformation campaigns often center around fake stories and falsehoods regarding human trafficking, when human trafficking is very real and it impacts African American communities, inner city communities more than anything, but it also impacts rural communities. Human trafficking is a big problem in Ohio. When you go to the auditor of state, I think it is, or it's some of the state offices. It's a huge initiative. The Attorney General, that's what I'm looking for. The Attorney General, it's a huge initiative for the Attorney General in Ohio to try and stop human trafficking. And you're absolutely right. It's not something that you hear about or that is talked about. It's just like the opioid crisis. That is not something that's talked about. But in the rural communities, there are whole rural communities that are being wiped out by the opioid crisis.
Wow.
And opioid addiction. And it's also a crisis and an issue in the inner city.
Yes,
if you
it's
go
true.
to the library, there are people, they got Narcan at the library.
Really?
Because people are going into restrooms and using opioids in the restrooms.
Wow.
And passing out. And yeah, it's a problem all over, but it's not one that they're talking about and that we're hearing about.
The other piece I see here too that doesn't get talked about a lot is support for our veterans.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I've fought with veterans now since I've been running in 2018. I began learning about some of the issues that veterans face.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that veterans face is not being able to access aid and attendance. And that means that they get additional resources, money resources that help deal with some of the issues that might be more costly. And so in particular, traumatic brain injury, there was no resources being offered to people who have traumatic brain injuries to help with those issues. Like, for example, they might have to have aid, somebody come and help them with their daily task.
Mm-hmm.
And aid and attendance would pay for that person.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, it has to come out of the limited resources that they already get, whereby if you were missing a limb, you're going to get additional resources through aid and attendance to take care of your shortcomings without, having to operate without that limb. And so one of the things that I fought with one veteran, it was a white man from Middletown named James, and then a black woman, Dora, her husband, Lafayette, also from Middletown. Lafayette needed aid and attendance, and Dora had to sacrifice her career to take care of her husband, but
Wow.
they couldn't get additional resources, but yet she couldn't work because she had to take care of him.
Wow.
And Dora happened to work for James because James could not care for himself. So she took care of James. James also couldn't get aid and attendance, but he didn't have the cognitive skills
Mm-hmm.
to be able to manage his own affairs. And so I fought with on behalf of both of them and took their issues to our congressperson, the one I'm running against, and I took it to Senator Rob Portman and Sherrod Brown, and I said these individuals, Lafayette had cancer associated with his time in the military, and James struggled with some cognitive issues because of shrapnel from his time
Wow.
in the military. So I took their cases to our legislators, and ultimately they both were able to get aid and attendance. And in fact, it opened up the opportunity for every veteran who had those kinds of cognitive issues to be able to get aid and attendance. And so there's some ads running on the radio where they talk about if you drank the water and got cancer
Right.
in Camp Lejeune.
I've heard that.
Yeah, it was because of the work that I did to be able to get veterans service-connected aid and attendance and service-connected so that they could get those additional resources that covers the care that they needed for the cancer. So now it's opened the floodgates. And so any veteran who has had either of those issues have access now to those services because of that fight.
Well, Dr. Enid, you've made policy changes even not being officially in office.
Absolutely.
And so,
Absolutely.
So we just thank you for your hard work up to this point. And I want to give you the last word on this. Having known you for so many years, and your heart and just the things that you have done and accomplished. What would you say to your listeners now? Why should they vote for you?
Well, I mean, I've talked a lot about who I am. I've talked about what my concerns are and why I'm running for office. If there's anything at all that any of the listeners have heard that resonates with them, things that I've said I have fought for or I will fight for, I think that those would be the reasons why you would want to vote for me. And outside of the things we've already talked about, I will listen and I will ensure that whoever is in need has a voice in Washington, D.C., because that's why I'm going to D.C. I'm going to fight for the people. And so for anybody who is interested in having an advocate, a real representative, which is what the House of Representatives is all about. It's about having somebody to take the voice of the people to Washington, D.C.
Well, Dr. Enoch, we thank you for sharing with us. We appreciate you, all that you've done and all that you are planning on doing as you make your plans to go to Washington. Voters, on November 8th, you have a chance to see Dr. Enoch into office, and we hope that you'll come out strong and that you will give her support. Give her support, and I think she will be absolutely ideal for what's going on in our nation. So thank you for joining another session of God's Provisions, and we bless you.